The number one reason not to move to Georgia. I'll be pointing out some extreme details, so make sure to watch until the end. If you saw my 5 reasons not to move to Georgia video, you may remember me talking about it actually. So what is my number one reason not to move to Georgia? You might be thinking it's the traffic, but it's deeper than that. It's the lack of public transportation. And I'm curious to know if you agree with me or not. What is your number one reason not to move to Georgia? Drop it in the comments below. What's up guys, this is Tim Trevathan with Tim Trevathan Homes and Keller Williams Realty. My job is helping people just like you find their new home in Atlanta, Georgia. If you're planning to move to the area, I would love to hear how I can help you, whether it's a call, text, or email, however you want to get a hold of me. Sometimes clients ask me what the pros and cons are of living in Georgia and specifically living in Metro Atlanta. I have lived in North Metro Atlanta for years and there's a lot I love about living here. But there is one glaring con: the lack of public transportation. When you think of New York City transportation, what comes to mind? Probably the subway, right? San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Boston are also known for having extensive public transportation networks. If you've ever been to Europe, you know that much of the continent is connected by rail, and in most of the major cities, you can easily get around by train or bus. The same is true of major cities in Asia. You can get almost anywhere you need to go via public transportation. Atlanta is a major city. In much of the world, people will know you are from the US if you say you are from Atlanta. Yet, despite its status as a major world city, public transportation here is almost non-existent. Car ownership is more or less mandatory in Atlanta. Of course, not everyone is fortunate enough to own a reliable vehicle, and people who don't have a car may have to rely on what public transportation we do have and rides from friends, because taxi and services like Uber or Lyft for most people here are cost prohibitive for use on a daily basis. Most jobs are not walkable from most homes, and not owning a car seriously limits your job opportunities, especially if you're unable to secure a work from home job. So, how did we get here? Why does such a major city have such minimal public transport? What does this mean for us as a city in the future? Hop into a time machine with me and let's go back in history about 60 years. But first, let's start with a quick look at the current public transportation situation. Meet MARTA, standing for Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority. MARTA is the City of Atlanta's public bus and train service. It serves about 500,000 of the metro area's 5 million residents. Train service runs on one north-south line and one east-west line. Together, both rail lines span only 48 miles. The system's bus routes cover 1,000 miles. That sounds like a lot at first, but Metro Atlanta's 11 counties have well over 10,000 miles of country roads between them. And that's not counting the thousands of miles of state roads in the counties. MARTA bus services cover only a fraction of Metro Atlanta's roadways. There are county public transportation services, but again, routes in the county transportation services don't begin to cover the entire county, thus making residents very car dependent. Let's look at history and see how we got here. Back in the day, there was initially a lot of enthusiasm surrounding the idea of public transportation in Atlanta, and it was seen critical to the future of a vibrant, growing city. In the 1960s, a study committee recommended a rail and bus system covering the city of Atlanta and the 5 surrounding counties, and in 1965, MARTA was approved by the state legislature. Today, 60 years later, MARTA only spans part of 2 counties in the heart of Atlanta. So what happened? As with most things involving government-funded projects, progress was slow. It took almost a decade from that first recommendation before the tracks started being laid, and it took until the mid-1990s until the rail system that we have today was completed. But MARTA was doomed almost before it began. Initially, MARTA was slated to cover Clayton, Cobb, DeKalb, Fulton, and Gwinnett counties. However, Cobb County voters rejected MARTA the same year the state legislature approved it. Though initially approved, voters in Clayton and Gwinnett counties rejected MARTA just a few years later in 1971. So MARTA ended up only being built in DeKalb and Fulton counties in the city of Atlanta. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, Cobb, Clayton, and Gwinnett counties were transitioning from sparsely populated rural counties to growing suburbs, and the racial composition was almost entirely white. Whereas the city of Atlanta, Fulton County, and DeKalb County were hemorrhaging white people at a rapid rate and were majority black. The votes by Cobb, Clayton, and Gwinnett counties to reject MARTA ostensibly had to do with tax increases, but in reality were race-based votes hinging on white residents' fears of crime being brought into their quiet rural and suburban communities. At the same time, the state had recently been on a highway building spree, and the automobile was king. Everyone wanted shiny new cars, and what better place to show it off than the new highways that were, at the time, some of the widest in the world. Gas was cheap too. In fact, cheaper than Alabama at one point. MARTA ended up with a reputation that it was for poor working class, primarily black residents in the heart of Atlanta. There was no perceived need for a mass public transit system in the Atlanta suburb. Fast forward to present day, and public transportation is still struggling in Atlanta. Thus, why it is my #1 reason not to move to Georgia. MARTA has been rejected 3 more times, specifically in Gwinnett County. First, it was rejected soundly in 1990, largely due to fears of easy access to the suburbs, meaning crime would move from the city into the suburbs. In 2019, expansion came closer to success and had more bipartisan support, but yet again suffered a substantial defeat. While there was still some fears of crime coming from the heart of Atlanta out to the suburbs, the county had gone from majority white to the most diverse in the Southeast, and the reasons for rejecting MARTA had changed. In the 2019 plan, Gwinnett's transit system would have contracted with MARTA, which had a reputation for corruption and fiscal mismanagement, and many voters felt like Gwinnett would be bailing out a poorly managed system. Also, rail expansion was only planned in one corner of the county, leaving many voters in the rest of the county wondering why they should agree to a special sales tax they didn't feel would benefit them despite a proposed increased bus service throughout the county. Opponents also didn't appreciate the idea of a special sales tax lasting 30 years. The MARTA referendum was also held during a special election, and those historically do not have great turnouts. In 2020, MARTA was on the ballot in Gwinnett yet again. This time it came very close to passing, failing by less than 2,000 votes. Once again, a special sales tax was viewed unfavorably by many voters, especially as it was on the ballot alongside an education-related special sales tax that did pass. Given the economic uncertainty during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, MARTA supporters feel many voters were uncomfortable voting yes for 2 special sales taxes. Also, many commuters were working from home, leading to less need for mass transit and less traffic for those who were still commuting on Atlanta's normally congested highways. There was simply less perceived need for transit expansion. Other residents who voted against MARTA expansion said they simply didn't feel like they understood how the expansion would benefit them. During the 2020 election, Gwinnett County decisively changed from red to blue, meaning the continued rejection of public transit expansion was bipartisan, despite bipartisan support for expansion from business leaders and county officials. So now in 2022, where do things stand with the future of improved public transportation here in Gwinnett County? The county says it is going back to the drawing board and wants to create an entirely new mass transit plan rather than continue to present a place that has been rejected multiple times before. Currently, the county says don't be surprised to see another mass transit referendum, but don't expect to see it before 2024 at the earliest. The county is also working on smaller projects that it can do now and doesn't need voter approval to enact. One thing the county has done is add bus routes to the Gwinnett transit system that can be funded through its annual budget. What is the status of MARTA in the other 4 original counties? In DeKalb, rail service exists in the northern part of the county, and the county wants MARTA to expand its rail service into the southern part of the county where there currently is no rail service. The problem is finding the local funding needed, and officials are considering proposing a special sales tax to pay for the rail expansion. In Clayton County, voters approved a special sales tax in 2014 that would fund expansion of the county's bus service by partnering with MARTA. In 2022, a project began to study options to add high-capacity rail service to the county in the future. Given the usual timeline for these sorts of projects, any sort of rail service in Clayton County is likely several years, if not decades, in the future. In Cobb County, the original MARTA holdout, there is a mass transit referendum slated for 2024 for a special tax that would allow the creation of rapid transit bus routes that would allow for easier connection with existing MARTA bus and train stations. The county asked residents if they would be interested in heavy or light rail coming to the county or an expanded bus service, and the preference was for bus service. Transit advocates will have an uphill fight to convince county residents to approve a special sales tax lasting for 30 years. The original plan was to have the referendum this year in 2022, but transit advocates decided delaying the referendum would provide more time to get their message out to Cobb residents and explain how residents would benefit from increased public transportation options. There's no denying Metro Atlanta has a traffic problem. Atlanta is the 10th most congested city per US News and World Report in 2019, with drivers losing an average of 82 hours a year to sitting in traffic. That congestion is only going to get worse, with the metro area's population expected to increase by almost 3 million people between 2015 and 2050. Meaning over 8 million people will call the area home and be traveling its roads. Right now, there are about 8 million people living in New York City. Now, do this for me. Imagine New York's roads. You've seen them on TV, even if you haven't seen them in person. Full of traffic, right? Now, pretend the subway system doesn't exist in New York. Put all of those subway commuters in cars on the streets. It would be an absolute traffic nightmare, right? Well, my friends, that's what Atlanta is looking at by 2050 if nothing substantial changes in regards to public mass transportation. And that is why the lack of public transportation is currently my #1 reason not to move to Georgia. You might wonder why I'm calling it a reason not to move to Georgia instead of a reason not to move to Atlanta. That's a great question. Nowhere in the state has awesome public transportation. But admittedly, everywhere else in the state is much smaller than Metro Atlanta and has much less traffic. However, those 2.9 million people who are projected to move here will have to live somewhere. And that somewhere is going to be in continued growth and development of the currently outer suburbs of Metro Atlanta. The metro area is slowly but surely creeping outward in all directions, especially to the north, south, and east of the city. Right now, if you head north to Gainesville and Dawsonville, south to McDonough, or east to Winder, you still feel like you've gotten out of Atlanta. That is quickly changing as development continues to march along and bring new residents and their cars with them. Buford is one of the most popular areas in Gwinnett County. Currently, it takes about 60 to 90 minutes to get from Buford to downtown Atlanta during a typical commute. What if there are thousands of more Gwinnett residents on the road over the next few decades? How would that affect your commute time? Will that 60 to 90 minute commute turn into a 2-hour commute? Only time will tell. If you aren't a Braves baseball fan, pretend you are for just a minute. What if instead of about an hour to get to a game, it took you closer to 2 hours? Would you still want to go to a game, or would you opt to stay home and watch it on television? It will be interesting to see what happens in Atlanta over the next few decades. Will people simply tolerate longer commutes as an unfortunate reality of life? Or will they leave Atlanta and move to a smaller city somewhere else, or head to another larger city, but one with better transportation options? Will companies continue to move their headquarters to Atlanta, or open regional offices here at the same rate as now, or will the congestion become a turnoff at some point? Lots of questions, no answers. We know mass public transportation can be done, and it can be done really well. Europe and Asia are fantastic examples. You can look at signage in the stations, or in many cases download an app to your phone, know exactly what time your train will arrive. Their rail networks are so robust in many places that you are never more than a few minutes walk from the nearest train station. That means you can take a train from almost anywhere in the city to almost anywhere in the city. Residents can take the train to work, to friends' homes, to the doctor, to church, to school, to pretty much wherever in the city they need to go. Many times, urban and suburban residents in Europe and Asia don't even own a personal car. That is how robust their public transportation systems are. In fact, I lived in South Korea for 5 years, and I never owned a car, never needed one, and life was just fine. One great benefit of that is the cost savings. I use myself as an example. I drive a Toyota Camry. It's a solid vehicle and doesn't have a reputation for being particularly expensive to drive or maintain. So here's the stats on my transportation expenses. My car payment is $400 a month. My car insurance runs about $120 a month. And car maintenance comes out to about $1,000 a year, which averages out to $83 a month. Gas, which I know has gone up over this past year, is about $200 a month. If you total all this up, that adds up to $783 a month. That means transportation costs me just under $800 a month. I used to be an English teacher and lived in Seoul, South Korea, as I mentioned before, for 5 years. Seoul is a massive metropolis renowned for its excellent public transportation network, one of the best in the world, some would argue. Here were my transportation expenses in Seoul. Subway and bus card ran me about $150 a month. No car payment, no car insurance, no car maintenance, and no filling up a car with gas. I didn't own a car in South Korea simply because I didn't need one. The public transportation was that good. So here in Metro Atlanta, it cost me over $9,000 a year to get around and do all the activities of my daily life versus a cost of under $2,000 a year when I didn't need a car and could depend on public transportation. That's a difference of $7,596 a year. Imagine what you could do with an extra $7,500 in your pocket each year. Besides the cost savings to residents, great public transportation has other benefits as well. Remember how I just said it currently would take about an hour to go from Buford to a Braves game? Once you get here, you must battle the thousands of other attendees for a parking spot and then take the long walk to the stadium, unless you decide to fork over the money for a premium parking space. With great public transportation, you simply take a train to the nearest stop and walk a few minutes to the stadium. And then when the game is over, you take the train back to the stop that's just a few minutes from your home. So much less hassle. Plus, when cities don't have to be constantly focused on widening roads or building entirely new roads to help offload traffic from existing roads, they have more green space that can be kept green and thus beautify the city, or can turn the land into walking trails, parks, or other pedestrian-friendly spaces that benefit the community. Look, don't get me wrong, Atlanta is a great city and there's a lot to love about it. I've done deep dives into several cities here in the North Metro area and invite you to look at my playlist and check them out if you are considering moving to Atlanta or trying to decide where in the metro area to live. Atlanta is just a short drive from the beautiful North Georgia mountains, and you can be at a beach in just a handful of hours, and there's a rapidly growing diversity everywhere in the Metro Atlanta area, and there are a lot of really friendly people here. There is truly a lot to love about living here. But like I said, I'm always honest with my clients, and my number one reason not to move to Georgia is definitely the lack of public transportation and the resulting traffic nightmare. If I haven't turned you off from moving to the area, feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear about your dreams, help you find a great home for your family. So don't forget to subscribe. See you on the next video.